How do you create a positive culture? One in which people feel valued and like they are contributing to the big picture, not just the day-to-day. How do you foster collaboration within your teams? Well, in today's episode, we're diving deep into the challenges faced by business leaders in giving their teams direction and leadership, and particularly how to make sure your team understand how they can help deliver the long-term vision. So to shed light on these crucial issues, I have the honor of interviewing Sophie Theen, a distinguished HR and operations executive, non-exec director, and award-winning author. With a career marked by successful transitions from owning HR divisions and leading large teams to running her own consultancy and acting as a mentor to women in tech, Sophie brings a wealth of experience and insight to our discussion. So if you want to get valuable lessons and strategies around this topic that are applicable to leaders at every stage of their careers, don't miss this episode. Welcome to De-Stress Your Business, the podcast where we show you how to get incredible results in your business without constant stress. I'm Alexis Kingsbury, a serial entrepreneur and founder at AirManual, and I'm joined by Sophie Theen. Welcome, Sophie.
Thanks for having me, Alex. It's very excited.
Yeah, me too. And this has been a long time coming. I've been really excited to interview you about, and there are so many things that I could interview you on, but I want to start with perhaps talking about the pivotal moments in your career that have shaped your approach to leading and guiding teams.
I think the most pivotal experience or moment I had throughout my career to actually change or look at the way I do leadership and think about leadership right now has been being in a startup, as well as trying to derive a career out of a startup environment, has put you through the ringer, dare I say it, through and through, right? Different stages of the startup, different growth paces, different demands from both your investors, your leadership team, as well as the employees that come in at different phases in your career. And I think all of that has really shaped the way I think about leadership. And so therefore that cascades into my management style, or how I build teams, or how I advise other people to build teams. So I think that is probably the most pivotal moment or an environment, to be frank, to get me to where I am today.
Nice. But through my own experience of building startup businesses and working with others, I know how weird the concoction of the kind of stress, and you're trying to work long term, but at the same time you've got to hit short term hurdles, and you're growing fast, so you're bringing in new people, and often the people who are managers and leaders are as new to it as the people in the business are. What does that feel like for the leaders and those that are being led by them?
You're absolutely right. And when you're in an environment like that, you really have to make quite a succinct choice. Do you want people who are doers that can, they have resilience, they have the mental capacity for resilience to start with? This is something I think, it's such a core skill or competency in an individual that we take for granted. Every so often we go through a talent acquisition process and we ask all these really good behavioral questions. But how often do you find yourself as a leader actually asking that question outright? How resilient are you? This is the environment we're currently in. This is the environment we probably are going to be in for the next 3 to 6 months, or maybe 12 months time. How do you think you're going to navigate yourself through this environment, right? And that is such an important question we forget to ask. So that brings it back to, that's essentially the leadership skill that you need to have. So as a leader, if you are not resilient and you don't know how to navigate these kind of challenges, it's pretty impossible for you to actually build a very healthy, at pace team that is going to be successful in this company or this environment. And then at the same time, coming back to, the team that this leader is actually trying to build as well, is that becomes a non-negotiable for coming into this team, because the hurdles are, it's ongoing. You have Monday, this is the problem. Tuesday is a completely different problem. And dare I say, next Monday, we come back to exactly the same problem because we thought we have solved it. And most of the time in a startup environment, you're probably solving the problem for the first time in your life too, in your career. And so there's a lot of this need for mental resilience to be able to kind of navigate through these challenges and environment. So I think it applies to both the leader building the team and the team members in that particular space.
Sure. And when we're talking about resilience there, because I think sometimes resilience can be misinterpreted as essentially suck it up. Like, your ability to just go, oh yeah, nothing phases me much, or I'm not going to get too upset by things or whatever. What are you looking for there? Like in a leader who is trying to build their own resilience and that of their team, what are they really trying to look for and how are they trying to build that?
Yeah, someone who is actually able to really get deep down to understand the root cause of the particular problem and also not spend too much time in overcomplicating a problem. Ever so often, we try and overcomplicate something because we're very busy. We're losing perspective, right? We're losing objectivity because there's a lot of emotional attachment or responses towards a specific problem that you're facing. And so there's a really tricky balance here to be able to kind of go define it as something really simple enough for you to solve it, but actually also get to the bottom of it enough for you to truly understand what the problem actually is. And for me, being able to navigate and balance these two things is resilience, right? To have a thorough enough understanding of what the problem is so that it equips you to solve the problem in the right way helps you navigate this situation. So coming back to your point, I think that's a great question. People tend to think you are right. There is many people who think, having resilience means you suck it up, the whole thing about get shit done, right? Just get it done. It's fine. And then tomorrow's another day. And then you get really excited because you're in that adrenaline moment where you're solving problems on a daily basis. But at what point do you stop yourself in your tracks, especially as a leader, to go, well, it seems like for the last 30 days, I've been trying to solve the exact same problem. It feels like I'm making progress, but I'm actually not because I'm still in square one. So are you being busy for the sake of being busy, or are you actually able to solve the problem so that it doesn't happen again?
Love that. Yeah, I think it's fantastic. And in your book, The Soul of Startups, you explore how a founder's personality essentially influences the startup's culture that's being built up. And obviously the extent to which they are resilient and support the resilience of others will have a big impact on that. But perhaps more broadly, can you perhaps share an experience where you witnessed a founder significantly impacting the culture, either positively or negatively?
Yeah, of course. If we say, for example, if we take resilience as we were talking about it, in my experience and some of the examples you would see in the book as well, the epitome of the founders being able to kind of affect the culture that they are driving or building comes from the very fact that they have a slightly different appetite. They are a string that can be pulled to a much longer extent as compared to different people. There's always a different personality and characteristics when you're trying to describe an entrepreneur versus an operator, right? And so I think all of these things actually come into play. So I've had an experience where it's a great founder. We think that we have a really great culture. Everybody's just kind of like problem solving, getting things done on a day-to-day basis, very successful environment as well. But you can almost tell that the person with the highest strength of resilience is actually the founder itself, because they have a much larger appetite to push themselves through the very, very end of the cliff, whereas other people have less. And so then in that characteristic, it impacts the way you make decisions, the pace of making decision too. Some people have a higher risk appetite as compared to some other people, right? This is natural for us, depending on our background and how we've actually gone through our experience in our career. So that for me is a very positive way of looking at how the difference in tolerance and the difference in strength can actually impact the culture. Because if you, on the flip side, if you have a founder who's just kind of like pushing boundaries constantly, very willing to make risk and make very quick decisions without actually having a thorough understanding of the situation, this is where it impacts the whole company or the success actually negatively. So you can see both sides of the coin, but actually it's the same type of characteristics. I also think in my experience, to avoid situations where it actually goes down the wrong rabbit hole is when a founder is actually very equipped with a great executive team or like great leadership team that kind of levelizes, right? Neutralizes where the risks and the appetites are so that there's a lot more opinions, suggestions, and actually solutions in the room rather than just having it funneled from one person.
Nice. Yeah, and I think that it's something I see a lot with business leaders is, and particularly where you've got a sole founder of an organization, is sometimes a frustration that why don't they want this as much as me? Why can't my team, even leadership team, why can't they be as fast at coming to a conclusion, or as willing to take risk, or happy to push through these problems, or cope with more uncertainty? And I think sometimes that frustration plays out in some very negative ways. I think that there's high profile examples of some founders of well-known businesses where they've really come a cropper with the toxic culture that essentially has been highlighted and what's negatively been created. Companies come to mind like sort of Uber and Brewdog and so on, where there's various things that are leveled against that leader in that thing. But often I see that in even smaller businesses where it's just at the root of it, it's this frustration that why can't the team be more like me?
Yeah.
And of course, I think your point, which is they're different. And they're a string that can be pulled longer. There's more elasticity there. But I think the crucial thing is it's not just down to risk reward. It's not just, oh, well, they're the founder, so they get more money. They get more money out of all of this if it does well, therefore they're more willing. I've seen founders who are not incentivized by money at all. That's not really what they're interested in, but they just like the game of it. And, and so I think that has a big impact. One of the things that another knock-on impact of that I see is its impact on diversity and inclusion, where particularly sole founders, but even not with that setup, where leaders are often looking for people that are more like them, and they overvalue that.
Yeah.
Given your experience and the mentoring and so on that you do, what's your view on the importance of diversity and inclusion, and how do you help leaders break through often unconscious sort of biases and so on that lead to a non-diverse leadership team and organization?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the first things first is, for a long time, we oversimplify values and principles and behaviors in a company, right? We tend to, over the years, I have seen that it's gone from, this is a great shout out for companies that have done really well with having a very strategic set of values and principles that they use it to define their own DNA. And then actually also have companies who have just kind of picked out what looks like to be the best ones out of the greater or the more successful companies, and then just call it your own DNA. And I think there's a fine line here between oversimplifying it and actually making it purposeful for your company. So let's put this into perspective. There are companies who kind of go, we only have 5 set of values, and these are the only 5 set of values that we will use for eternity. And so therefore you cripple diversity and inclusion, because people are made up to be different things. You may have some non-negotiables that this is our DNA, you need to commit to this, otherwise you would not be successful. That's okay. But that actually forms part of your values too, because you're honest. You can easily call honesty as part of your values, right? But many companies don't do that. And this is where oversimplifying your values and principles on who you want to be and who you are already becomes a problem. And that cripples, again, diversity. If you say that as a company and as a build-up of a company, of the culture, you're only limiting yourself to 5 behaviors, I mean, that's a bit silly and that's a bit naive to say that this is the only thing that will ever work for you. But on the other hand, there are successful companies who just continue to evaluate their values, continue to evolve their values. It could have started from 3, and now they have a whole plethora of different behaviors that they signify as their DNA and as part of the indicators that have made them successful throughout the years. They could have been landed at 22, and that's okay. But that sets a really good expectation, because it's not something like, if I'm 10 out of the 22, then I am a better employee than a person that's actually 7 out of the 22. It makes it a little bit more inclusive, and this is where inclusion comes in. I can be who I am, the authenticity is there, but for as long as there is a balance between performing the role that I'm hired to do, we call them functional, technical, the hard skills that you have to do your role. And then on the other hand, is this the environment I want to be in? Can I flourish in this environment? And I think that's a great thing. So I think this comes back to, and I've seen this through and through in different companies as well, we're oversimplifying it because we're trying to take a shortcut to make that very difficult, sensitive conversation shorter and easier.
Nice. Yeah, and I can see how providing a bit more of that nuance, that complexity, and also making clear that it's not the case that we expect everyone to be 100% at all of these things all the time, and that it's okay to have more of a balance and have some strengths and weaknesses. I think is powerful, and particularly I can see that with, I'm fortunate to have a very diverse organization, and I can see even in my head, like individuals, how that kind of has fit better for them. So that's really cool. Thinking specifically about, mentioned in the intro that you mentor women in their leadership careers and so on. I'm interested in your perspective on some of the ways in which female leaders can be more encouraged.
Mm.
We've had a very recent example of the exact opposite with Harrison Butker speaking at a group of graduates recently, in which he essentially said that women are more interested in being homemakers than in their careers, something that I think is an absolutely disgusting thing to say, particularly to a group of people at the start of their careers. I think is particularly in the current environment that we're in. What's your reaction to that, and what should leaders in their organizations be saying about encouraging the careers of anyone in the organization, but particularly those that are perhaps less well represented?
Yeah, I think my first part of your question is what was my reaction. I was dumbfounded for a bit, in the sense that this was obviously is that the right environment to actually share your personal statement? I thought that wasn't shared in the right way. Obviously, you can't stop people from thinking about something a specific way, but to actually be in a leadership position, to be in an influencing position as well, to say something out loud, this shouldn't have happened and should not have been allowed to happen. Coming back to organizations and how we can encourage, fair and equal opportunities for every single person in an environment or in a company per se. And obviously this is drawing from my experience being, female entrepreneurs and female founder coach as well, is the thing that most companies struggle the most with is the lack of opportunity to actually have a platform to talk about the things, right? This isn't about promoting more women in a workplace. This isn't about changing your framework in a promotion panel to specifically ask those questions of more underrepresented people. This is more about, as an individual, how can I be my authentic self if I cannot have the platform to be my authentic self? And this is a lot of this is something that is so commonly talked about, but very difficult to actually implement in a workplace. How would you feel if you have a male founder and he creates a platform, but he sits in this platform and he is either told to not speak too much so that you don't stifle the conversation, or to bring in too much of your own opinion that is actually seen as being backfired, right? It's a very hard place to be in. So, which is why it's a great idea, but many companies are still struggling to actually implement, to create an authentic platform for all types of people to be successful. And I think this comes down to, how the people team plays a huge part in actually enabling environments like this to happen. And when I say a platform, it doesn't need to be, it's an invite in your calendar. Let's talk about your feelings. This really isn't it. This is about, do you have parts of your process or your life cycle where we as a company are talking about, do these values still work for us? Does this block me from my career if I don't have this? Are people allowed to ask that question? If I don't show resilience, does it mean I'm actually not going to really progress too far in my career? Maybe not the right environment for me. But at what point are you actually able to ask that question? So I really think, as leadership, this isn't a action per se. This is about continuously thinking about the concept of creating authenticity as a platform for the company.
Yeah, I love that. I really appreciate your sort of nuanced and sophisticated understanding of this, because I think that it isn't an all or nothing. It isn't a sort of binary, get it right, get it wrong. As you say, it's an appreciation and an acceptance of that and a process of continuous improvement. I think that's one of the things that I've found, is that I love the fact that we, in relative terms, kind of embrace setting some values and going deeper into what are all the behaviors that we're looking for, and how do we then embed that into our processes of recruitment and performance management, all these sorts of areas in which we work, but at the same time continuously kind of identifying areas where, oh, that doesn't quite feel in line with our values, or, you know, should we round this value out a little bit because I feel like it overweights on this. And I think that's an important point, that it's a process, it's a journey that you go through in terms of shaping that culture. One of the other challenges I see is that short-term versus long-term, you know, particularly when you're trying to balance the kind of the objectives and key results, the projects, the long-term targets versus delivering the day-to-day. Can you perhaps share an example of how you've helped an organization that perhaps found that tricky, and how you help them navigate that challenge?
Yeah, I think it's tricky for every organization, right? At every stage in their life as well. I think it comes down to the people that you hire and how you set the expectations. Many companies, in my experience, I have seen them struggle with the fun stuff being the day to day, because you know how it's like, right? When you are you've got a checkbox list, and every day you're taking something off, and that feels great for you, but then actually, does it really take you or bring you to the very final objective? Is a completely different story, because you are so short-sighted in thinking about, on a day-to-day basis, you know, your logic will tell you, if I'm making progress this way, I should be able to hit the final goals or the long-term goals. But in a specific environment, for especially, you know, a startup environment where everything changes overnight, possibly some do that, you know, decisions being pivoted on at any basis in time, because it's needed for its survival, or probably for growth, or whatever scenario they put themselves in. And then at the same time, there's this dynamic, constant change in a startup environment. And so what that means is, if you don't know how to balance between long-term goals versus your day-to-day goals, then you've got a problem. And this is why you see a lot of evolution of the company starts off with, we're all good people, we're all getting the job done. And how many times have you had that conversation where you sit in the room and you go, 3 years later, this person no longer works for us? Because they call it as the company's outgrown them. It's the same thing with your process. If you don't get it right from the start, you will outgrow your own process. And this is where the struggle comes in, right? You think about an OKR system. You know, there's so many different frameworks out there, but as an OKR framework, the first things first is to identify what your really overstretched goal is. You don't ask yourself whether or not you can achieve them, but you only ask yourself, how do you get there? And if you become really strategic, even in your day-to-day and your first starting point, then you find yourself in a situation where you're less likely to fail, because you're actually embedding the skeletons of what needs to happen. But when you're in such a vibrant environment, people get really distracted. They're ticking off boxes. They forget to ask themselves that questions. And this is more commonly I have seen in leaders in a smaller organization, or I'm asked to come in to help them solve a problem because they're about to pivot, and suddenly they found themselves carrying a lot of baggage. But they created the baggage themselves.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And if we were to give a sort of key takeaway, a top piece of advice to leaders more generally, and then if I can ask a bonus question, I'm interested in whether that advice changes depending on whether the leader is male or female, and if so, why?
Great. Very tricky question. Okay, I'm going to try my best here. Top advice for leaders is to be authentic and to be honest in the way that you want to run a company, you want to build a company, and you want to build the culture, because we know these are the things that keep you up at night. Whether or not this advice changes between a female and a male leader, I don't necessarily think so. But the perception of honesty may be different, just like the perception of resilience may be different. I coach a female entrepreneur, female founder, who have actually taken a 5-year gap in their career because they have been a stay-at-home mom, but it doesn't stop them from actually being really ambitious to start a company of completely they're driven by their passion. And so the way they look at resilience is, they have gone through days where they have no sleep for months, and they're still able to actually function to do their most basic day-to-day without fail, because lives are at stake, for example, right? You can't forget to feed a baby just because you're tired. And so I think, you know, in this context per se, the advice doesn't change so much depending on the person, but it does come down to the background and how they perceive that particular thing.
Nice. I really like that. I love your point. It's the nuance underneath that. It's the, what do we actually then mean by, as you say, being the honesty, the transparency, the authenticity? What are the examples that come in? That's really, really interesting. Fantastic. Well, I could talk to you all day, Sophie, but where can people learn more from you?
Sure. My book is called The Soul of Startups. It's on Amazon and on other platforms as well. So obviously that's where you can get more of my kind of like nuggets and experiences. And I'm also easily reachable on LinkedIn. So I would encourage anybody who wants to continue this conversation to reach out to me. Otherwise, just on my website, sophietheen.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Sophie. It's been amazing talking to you. I really, really appreciate it. And for everyone listening, thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you found today's content valuable, and I'm sure you did, then please just take a minute to leave a review on your favorite podcast platform or share the episode on social media and tag us in. I'm always surprised by the number of people that will come up to me when I'm at events and so on. They go, oh, I love the podcast. I really enjoyed this particular episode. And I'm thinking, that is amazing. I love it. I'm so glad you shared that with me. But I haven't seen you share anything on social media. so please do so. Be social through this media. Please do tag Sophie and I in. We'd really appreciate it. And it genuinely makes a big difference. So otherwise, Sophie, thank you so much for joining me today. And to everyone else, until next time, have fun.